So please join me in giving a warm Georgia Tech welcome to Millie Bradley.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. It's a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I will make one bio update. We have 3.5 grandchildren. One's coming in December, so we're getting an extra Christmas present this year. How you lead matters. That's the topic for this afternoon. And it's really to talk about leadership from the standpoint, not necessarily of specific skills, but the behavior that you try and embrace as a leader and what impact that can have on the culture of an organization, certainly the performance of an organization, and the ethical environment of an organization. It's something that I've become very passionate about, particularly serving as general auditor in ExxonMobil, and I'll get into a little bit of that background in just a minute. Is it relevant to think about this? You betcha. Ethics makes good business sense. We're going to talk about some of these cases. You may have seen them in the newspaper. We're talking about big dollar impacts of some breakdown in either controls or ethics in some of these companies. And the question is, why does that happen, and what can you as leaders do as you start your leadership journey in the business world to try and make sure that you're contributing to an environment of integrity and ethics in all of the corporations you deal with? And let me say, and I will say it several times, these are not unethical companies. These are tremendous companies with great brands and great organizations, but people make mistakes. And how do you try and run an organization so that those mistakes are less frequent? Just a little background. I'm not going to dwell on what I call the infrastructure of controls, but if you're going to have any kind of ethics and controls in an organization, you need a controls framework like this. You need very sound policies that are understandable. You need clear delegation of authority. You need to know what your risks are in any organization, what kind of controls you need to mitigate those risks, and who's checking up to make sure the controls are working. It's a very standard environment. It's very sizable to whatever kind of organization you're dealing with. And it's not only for profit. This is for the nonprofit world. This is for the academic world. This is for the government world. Anytime you're trying to set up an environment of ethics and controls. And you need training. You need to make sure that people in your organization understand this. This works in startups too. It's just scaled down to those kind of environments. And you need a strong tone at the top. And in fact, after a number of corporate debacles in the late 90s, early 2000s, the Senate and Congress legislated through the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that in fact that controls framework and tone at the top was a requirement of publicly held companies. And so they are held to that standard. So let's take an example. Walmart, great company. When Sam Walton founded it in 1962, he had a pretty basic tone at the top. Personal and moral integrity is one of the basic fundamentals, and it starts with each one of us. Very nice, clean statement. Mr. McMillan, the current CEO, again, in the annual report, he states very clearly the kind of company that Walmart is. So along comes 2004, and allegations of bribery in Mexico City with government officials and the manager, Walmart manager in Mexico City, arise. The government, U.S. government, starts to investigate to see if there was violation of the Corrupt Practices Act in the U.S. That extended then to India and China. $800 million to date spent on this issue. And you can see the legal settlements are about the same amount. So this is big business, perhaps the decisions of just a few people impacting a very great company. And so how do you meet the challenge, particularly if you're in an organization with a large footprint, to try and establish that kind of culture and have it permeate the organization, because you not only need the framework, you not only need tone at the top, you need it all through the organization. The reality is that most people are good people. I firmly believe that. But they get in situations where they make bad decisions. And so it's really the responsibility of all the leaders in organizations around the world to try and promote a culture of good decision-making and ethical decision-making. So we're going to spend a little time this afternoon to kind of talk about how do you do that, what are some of the traits that you can perhaps think about and embrace as you build your leadership career in whatever venture you're going to undertake. So what kind of skills are we talking about? Honesty is kind of a throw on the table, right? We all think we're basically honest people. I think we are basically honest people. Statistic Brain Research Institute, I love that name. I don't know that much about the institute itself, but they did some work in 2015. It's pretty mind-boggling to me, but the results of their survey indicated that in the people that the employees that they interviewed, 75% admitted they had stolen from their company at least once. Now, theft can have a grand continuum, if you will, but nevertheless, 75% admitted that. They looked at the bankruptcies in the US in 2015. 33% could be traced to some form of employee theft or ethical misconduct. So again, this is big business. This is impacting a lot of organizations and impacting a lot of lives, frankly. When they looked at root causes, those are the root causes they came up with. Pressure can take on a lot of forms. What incentives are in place? What kind of rationalization occurs as you're making some of these decisions? What's the opportunity? Are you under financial stress? That's where leadership comes in. And we're going to talk about what leaders can do or what they don't do to create an environment where perhaps bad decisions are made. So let's look at, I can't talk about honesty without mentioning Mr. Kozlowski. He's sort of the poster boy for corporate theft. He ran Tyco in 2005, was investigated for a whole suite of theft in the company. I've shown them there, illegal bonuses, a $2 million birthday party for his wife, charged to the company an $18 million apartment, my personal favorite, a $6,000 shower curtain. But what's astounding was his testimony. To me, it's astounding that in his testimony during the trial, he said no management in the company ever received anything to which they were not entitled. Hence the issue, the treacherous journey of entitlement. And this doesn't have to be CEOs that do this. I think you can get caught in an entitlement trap very early in your career, particularly if you're successful and you're getting promoted and now you're taking trips and now you feel like you're entitled to more because you're working very long hours, you're on call 24/7 perhaps. And so it is a trap that I think from an ethical standpoint, when you develop your leadership self, to think about, because it can lead to difficult situations in your environment. Perceptions. This isn't the kind of thing that you're worried about what people think about you. It's developing a social awareness so that you're not only thinking inside out, what do you want to do, what do you feel needs to be done, what decision do you need to make, but turning that outside in and thinking about what impact is it going to have on other people, what impact is it going to have on your organization. I'll give you an example. Airplane manufacturer is in negotiations with the U.S. government. This is a real case. $20 billion in contracts being negotiated. The CFO of the manufacturer offers the Air Force Chief Acquisition Officer a job. Is that a conflict of interest? Now I've kind of set the scene, so you say, oh yeah, I shouldn't have done that. Well, now stop and think. They may have been working together for years. They may have a good relationship because of the nature of the manufacturer and the government. So they've been working together for years. They even see each other socially, perhaps. Kids run the same soccer team. They go out for drinks one night. The government guy is complaining about how long it takes to get things done in the government. Corporate guy says, you know, one of these years you should just come work on the dark side of corporate America. You can get things done. You have such great skills. 2 weeks later, a job comes up. It sounds kind of innocent. Well, this happened to Boeing. They happen to be in the news for other reasons right now, but this was in 2004. This came up in a Senate investigation of Boeing pricing, and they found out about the job offer. So they started to investigate Boeing, the government. They immediately canceled a $1 billion contract. They suspended $5 to $10 billion in future contracts, which would have created 8,000 jobs in the course of those contracts. And Boeing's business was half the government. So this is a huge impact from one person's decision. Now, this happened to be a little more nefarious because the CFO and the acquisition officer actually were in cahoots with each other, exchanged confidential information, rigged some of the pricing for Boeing. So it clearly was a conflict of interest that turned into a serious matter. But I will tell you that those first four things could have happened even if it was totally innocent. And there is where perceptions matter. That's the crux of conflict of interest, is it doesn't matter if it's really a conflict. If people think it's a conflict, it's a conflict. We had a case up in our Alberta operation up in Canada where we got a hotline call. And one of the contractors who had lost a bid said that he had lost it because his competitor was friends with the manager of the plant. And in ExxonMobil, this is why I have developed such passion around this topic. We have about 250 internal auditors. We audit operations from drilling platforms to refineries to chem plants to IT to finance across 200 countries in the world. But the other thing that internal audit does is internal investigations. If there's any kind of allegation or suspicion of a policy violation, the operating organizations have to call audit. And audit does an independent investigation for both the sake of the company and the sake of the employee. And so you can imagine in the course of that broad a footprint, you see about every type of policy violation you could possibly have. So we went in and investigated this. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of traveling to Fort McMurray in Alberta, but it's a pretty small town, except for the workers in the oil sands activity. And it's so small that if you're going to have a fence put up at your house, it's probably someone who is also doing work at the plant. That's just the nature of the environment. The individual in question here did have some work done by a contractor who also did work at the plant, but the individual, the manager, had absolutely no role in awarding the bid. So from a pure conflict of interest standpoint, there was no conflict. But that contractor will always think there was a conflict because of that one other fact that that contractor had done work. And so the social awareness of outside-in thinking is just as a leader trying to develop that skill, and it's useful in any kind of leadership activity. It's just sensitivity to what could be implicating factors to what you're doing when you're making decisions. Incentives, motivation, a big factor in terms of what can cause people to make decisions. Meet Jerome. Jerome was a derivatives trader for Societe Generale. If you're not familiar, it's a bank in Europe, bank and financial services firm based in Paris. And he began trading. His incentive was based on trades, successful trades. The market started to turn, so he began to do trades to try and hedge the trades that were going south. And those began to go south, and he had technical skills. So then he created trades to offset those other trades that were going south. And by the time he was done, he had 50 billion euros in trades, which was more than the market cap of the company. Now, clearly, there's a control breakdown somewhere here because he should never have been allowed to do that. But the losses to Societe Generale $7 billion in US dollars. Huge impact, one individual who is still in the courts convinced that management knew about it and in fact incentivized him to make those trades. Rigging the system is kind of crossing the line, but we won't get too specific. So individual actions can matter, and you have to be careful how you try and motivate people as a leader. We'll talk about a more recent one, Wells Fargo. So Wells Fargo has an incentive system, has had an incentive system of cross-selling banking products. That's been in the banking industry for years. If you have a checking account, you should have a savings account. If you have a checking and savings account, you should have a credit card. Let me help you. And incentivizing banking employees if you sell more products, right? Well, somewhere in the Wells Fargo system, it became known that you could do this without even talking to the customers. You could just open accounts for the customers who already had an account. So they opened 2 million accounts across Wells Fargo. They opened credit card accounts. These are banking employees. In the end, 5,300 employees were terminated. That's a systemic breakdown of leadership. And the incentive itself is not bad. It's how you apply the incentive and whether or not, when you're trying to motivate people for good performance, do you always have the conversation about honesty and integrity and ethics. Interesting story, when we were doing ethics training in ExxonMobil, we decided that the senior managers around the world had been through ethics training probably 30 times. We would do it all the time. So we decided, we need to do something different. So we held roundtable discussions of the top 100 executives around the world. Just went around the world and had roundtable discussions about how they lead in order to assure there's an ethical environment in the company. And one aha moment we had was ExxonMobil will say that safety and ethics are their two most significant values, and they vie for which one is more important. Every meeting in ExxonMobil usually starts with a safety moment. We talk safety all the time. People say we drive them crazy. But we don't talk ethics all the time. We train in ethics at the time. But if you're in the day-to-day furor of making decisions, do you then say, now just wait a minute, we're cutting costs, we're looking for ways to cut costs, we make sure we don't sacrifice the standards we have in the company. And so you have to have that kind of penetration of an ethical environment as part of your leadership skill set. Communication, huge. Words matter. If you come back to Wells Fargo, Mr. Stump, former CEO, said 1% that did it wrong, we fired. This does not reflect our culture. We did not incentivize anyone to do bad things. 5,300 people lost their jobs. What do you think the rest of the company feels when they hear the leader say this? Do they think management has my back if I'm just trying to be a good employee? So words matter in terms of how you communicate to employees what's important about performance, what's important about the kind of standards you want in the company. This next example, I'm probably going to get in trouble, but I'll use it. You probably have heard about Deflategate. Happened a few years ago. The NFL felt that perhaps balls were being deflated in order to make them easier to throw. I know absolutely nothing about the facts of Deflategate. So I'm not making a statement here about fault. What I found curious, given the passion that I have around ethics and communication, was this was some of the first statements made publicly by three of arguably the best leaders in football that exists today. I can tell you, I've never done it. I didn't alter it. We've never done it. Now, if you're in the Patriots organization, and let's say you're in the equipment management area, how do you feel when you hear this? Do you feel inspired that they have my back? Not necessarily. So let's just role play. Perhaps you could say, look, the Patriots organization takes integrity seriously. And we follow the rules. That's part of our basic value set. If there's been a breakdown in our processes, we're going to find out, and we'll fix it. And you leave it at that. And it's a much stronger type of communication to your organization. I understand about personal liability and reputation and the like, but as a leader, outside in, also think about the people you're trying to lead. And particularly in cases like Wells Fargo, think about the survivors in the organization and what do you want them to learn from what the company has just gone through. And then leadership style. One of my favorites. I'm a type A leader. I set very specific goals. I demand results. I assess performance based on the ability to get results. It's all in how you do it. And hitting people over the head or creating fear is not only going to not achieve the best results, but it could lead to ethical issues in the organization. If people are fearful, they will hide mistakes, period. So as a leader, you have to figure out how to create a culture where it's okay to make mistakes, to learn from them. You're not going to abide by incompetence, but mistakes are part of the human system. Let's talk about Volkswagen briefly. Perfect storm. Volkswagen decided they wanted to dominate the US diesel market in the early 2000s, and they made it a very public goal. They were already owned or managed half of the diesel market in Europe, and they were after the US market. At about the same time, the US started strengthening emission standards, and the engines that Volkswagen had couldn't meet those standards. They also had a corporate culture of no failure. Mr. Winterkorn, you'll see his picture in a minute, would be quoted as saying, if you as an engineer can't find a solution to this, then I'll find an engineer who can find a solution. Every solution they came up with couldn't meet the emission standards. So flash forward, they figured out a way when the government was testing the engines, they would turn off some of the emission controls so that it would pass the tests, and then once they sold the cars, that fix was eliminated and the cars emitted above what the standards were. It was discovered by an industry professional who couldn't understand how Volkswagen could be so successful at this. Their sales went through the roof. It was a huge success. This industry professional group bought some Volkswagen cars just off the lot and started running emissions tests and found out that they weren't meeting emission standards, and then the government got involved. Turned out that they had rigged 11 million vehicles in the US. Over 50 employees admitted that they knew about it. And that's the discouraging thing. Those employees admitted it in the investigation, not during the process. $25 billion of cost to date. A huge impact on this business. Good company. Mr. Winterkorn, that kind of looks like a fearful management style. But suffice it to say, if that style is in place, then you probably will have problems occur. We had an accountant out in Asia, great professional, and she made a mistake in balancing the books at the end of the month. And it happened to be the month that audit was coming in. Now, auditors are nice. I'm the first one to say that, but she was fearful. And so she went in and just fixed it. And of course, audit came in, did the audit, and found the fix, and then called her in, and then she made a second, more fatal mistake, which was to lie to the auditors about the fix. So she didn't stay with the company. It was heartbreaking to the group, but we counseled and disciplined the supervisor as well. Because why would you have an environment exist where an accountant would feel uncomfortable bringing forward a problem in some accounting error. And so it can start at the smallest levels, and if you're running a project, if you're working in a small startup venture, if you're working in a nonprofit, the challenge is how do you instill a leadership style where people are comfortable coming forward and talking about issues, talking about problems, figure out why they occurred, and then let's fix them, as opposed to make it a personal liability. One of my favorite quotes, and it's absolutely true. People are going not remember what you said, they won't remember what you did, they will remember how you made them feel. And so as a leader, if you can be a servant leader to those that you're interacting with, either from a peer standpoint or a subordinate standpoint, then people will come to you for advice and they will follow you over the hill. And that is a much better leadership style to aspire to. Doesn't mean you sacrifice setting strong goals and demanding achievement, but it's all in how you do it when you're in the person-to-person interface. So my wrap-up is that, hands down in your curriculum here, concentrate on these. These are kind of your entry card to the business world, right? You've got to be technically good at what you do. That's how you get in the door. But focus on these competencies over here, because that's what distinguishes you as a leader. That's what will ultimately dictate your success in the world, and that's what will prevent some of the ethical and control breakdowns that we see. I'm convinced of that. And if you have as a personal mission to make the world a better place, that's where the answer may reside. So the question is, what kind of leader are you going to be? Questions? Yes. Yes.
Can you hear? Yeah, great. Thanks for coming, Millie. I guess my question is that since many ethical breaches are just mistakes in judgment, for example, that could be caused by any number of reasons, which you mentioned, are there any kind of interview techniques or selection techniques that could be used by senior management, some way screen out or screen for any predisposition to making unethical decisions? By
in terms of the recruitment the hiring process, I am probably not skilled enough to be able to answer that. I know there's research in that area in terms of diagnostic tools that recruiters are now suggesting as part of this. But, I think a lot of, in my experience, if you go on the basis of people, most people are basically good, honest people, it's a case of situational ethics. That you get into a situation and despite training and background, one of those factors comes into play, whether it's pressure or fear, and that causes you to do something that's not innate to your value system. That's my personal view. Now, whether or not there are some intrinsic traits in people that we could filter, I probably don't have the background to be able to say that, but
it seems like you could have two people, one person in that same situation would make the ethical decision, and the other person in that very same situation would make the unethical decision.
You could. I just don't know if that's an intrinsic nature that you could filter out in a recruiting process, as opposed to manage your way out of it by setting clear expectations as to what the environment is in the organization you're dealing with, and then make sure people understand it and talk about it. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. I'm a little late to this, but I just wanted to say I'm Jared. I'll be one of the Q&A moderators.
Okay.
I know.
You're going to keep us honest.
Jump the gun a little
Honesty.
bit. I'm sorry. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming here and for speaking to us. And I did want to ask a question myself.
Okay.
And firstly, who dat? I'm a New Orleans native.
Hey,
so,
yay.
Hey.
All right.
But it seems like ethics, honesty, just moral decisions, there's something that's sort of core to you. Can you remember a moment in your life, whether it was in your childhood or in your adult life, where you sort of had that aha moment where you said, this is something that I want to dedicate my personal life to, impacting others through ethics and making sure that we can make the world a better place from human to human?
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of upbringing, I won't give away age here, but I grew up at a time in the world, and this is now politically incorrect to say, so I'll apologize ahead of time, but things were more black and white from a value standpoint. We live in a world of gray now. In fact, I used to have a chart that I would put the cover of the book 50 Shades of Gray, and I'd scratch out 50 and say too many, because I think the world is a much grayer place now from a value set standpoint. And so upbringing was part of it, that we had very strong upbringing around right and wrong. So, you know, when the airlines came out and said that you should turn your phone off when you take off, I'm the person who pushes the button because the guy next to me has his phone on and he's having a phone call. You know, so there is some intrinsic thing going on there based on upbringing. But I came about this more from the standpoint that over the course of 34 years, most of those jobs were leadership jobs. The scope varied quite a bit as you progressed through your career, but if you want to be a leader, you can be a leader on day one. Leadership doesn't have to be a title. It's how you influence people and motivate other people. And so I really came at it more from the standpoint of being intrigued with leadership. And then once I got onto the investigatory side and made that connection, it's like, gee, there is a connection here. And I really do think it can have a significant impact. So now it is very hard to read a newspaper or the Wall Street on my tablet and not have that filter. And it really does affect, and it's a good filter to have as a leader. Someone else, yes.
So obviously we're talking about leadership affecting downward. If you were to talk about the reverse, if you were an employee in a company where you are fearful of your leadership and things like that, how could you potentially bring it up to employers when they may not realize the environment they're creating? Right.
Tough issue. Some of it goes back to that framework, that infrastructure, because if companies take this seriously, there are a whole suite of ways that employees should be able to bring things forward. Everything from anonymous hotlines to your HR organization, to your audit organization, to your external audit organization, if depending on the severity of it. The other thing is there are mentors that you should develop in an organization that can help you grow professionally, and those can also be a source of input and output if you have something that really bothers you. But I think that trying to get informed about what those other outlets are is absolutely critical, because it is tough. I mean, if you've got a boss that's one of these fear mongers, how are you going to go in? I have tangled with some bosses, and it's not fun. And if, depending on where you are in the organization, if you don't have a position of power, it's pretty hard to do. So you have to find some other outlets to do it.
Early in your presentation, you mentioned how critical it is for leaders to set the tone, to be this, constant example of their company's values and standards. So, obviously, we aren't CEOs yet. So, how do you suggest that we apply this concept to our everyday lives as students?
Yeah, I appreciate the yet. Good to have ambitions, yeah. But, I think it's thinking of yourself as someone who can impact other people. And so it can be something as simple as making decisions around social life or around how you treat other people. It's developing kind of a moral compass early on that you're comfortable in who you are and what your value set is, or you're experimenting, so you just have a dialogue about it. Like I said, you can open the newspaper every day and find something to talk about on this topic. Do you think it's okay to pay someone to change SAT scores? Is it a donation, or is it bribing to get into USC? Have the conversation, because it's only through those conversations that you start, to me, that's the real joy of college life. It's when you're developing those kinds of standards internally based on conversations you're having. So that's what I would be doing now. Talk about leadership, talk about the kind of leader you want to be, and then take real life examples and say, well, what would you do in that kind of case? Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your time. Question I want to ask you, you went over the perception matter.
Right.
And in that you talked about how important it is as leaders to be sensitive to the people you're working with. So my question for you is, what practices over the course of your career helped you remain sensitive to the people of your organization?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I'll say in the training we do, we use 2 litmus tests, which I love. One is if you're making a decision, if that decision is on the front page of the Wall Street tomorrow morning, would you be okay? And secondly, if you called your mother tonight and told her about it, would she be okay? And if you pass those 2, you're a long way to making a good decision. But I think it's a question of thinking about impact. Who are the constituencies or victims of a decision that you're making? And how are they going to feel about it? Just making that one simple step, whether you're changing the schedule of a project, whether you're giving some performance feedback to someone, just trying to juxtapose yourself into some other views is a tremendous value to have. The other thing I would say is start your journey of introspection now and make it last for 30 or 40 years. The leaders who are really effective to me are the ones who are introspective. They consistently look at how they're leading and they modify what they're doing based on what they're seeing happen. So developing that sense early and continuing challenging yourself, whatever technique you need to do. If you need to go on a retreat, if you need to set aside 8 o'clock on Monday morning to think about whatever, the extent to which you can build that in early is a real value.
Hi, Millie.
Hi.
I'm Kendall. Again, thank
Hi,
you
Kendall.
for coming. I appreciate it. So kind of going off of that, you said that perception is reality. And I've actually been thinking about that concept a lot recently and was just wondering if you've seen like kind of a system of like checks and balances to assist leaders maybe wanting to develop this introspection but like yet don't have that skill like put in place so that they can gain that social awareness and understand what people's perceptions of them are, perhaps when they're caught up in the work, caught up in the grind, but need to be reminded of their values and what's important to them.
Yeah, I think, clearly in an organization it starts with training. And so the extent to which you have discussions in groups about that issue, it can be very powerful. I personally get a little concerned at the trend towards online ethics training in companies. In ExxonMobil, every 3 years, all 100,000 employees go through face-to-face training for 2 to 3 hours. And it's delivered by management, not by audit, and not by HR, and not by law. And the concept that your bosses get up and talk about it is a very powerful concept. And the other technique that I always appreciated is every year, in addition to coming in and doing stewardship of your financial and operating performance, you came in and did stewardship of your ethics performance in your organization. So any ethics violations, any investigations, the presidents and vice presidents had to come in and give a presentation on that as well. And so it ingrained the importance of it. You have to look for ways to try and talk about it and ingrain it in the day-to-day. One technique, most companies have a system, part of this framework, where you have to sign that you've read the policies and you know what they are. It's one of the first things audit looks at in an investigation. Did they sign the form? But it's easy to do that, but not understand how they apply to your job. And so we used to get together when it was time to do that, and let's say it was a financial reporting group, would say, well, okay, we have a conflict of interest policy. What could possibly be a conflict of interest in a financial reporting group? And talk about it to make it more real to an individual and a person rather than a corporate policy. And so it's getting down to the personal and individual level that's the challenge. That's why these great companies have problems out in Mexico City or Asia or whatever. How do you penetrate all the way through the organization? And that's a leadership challenge. Mm-hmm.
Hi. So I'm back. So you mentioned that you had the higher up managers doing an ethics roundtable discussion. What were their takeaways and feedback about that experience? As well, and going along with that, how do you get people who are making the impact and setting the tone for ethics compliance to value it and put in a priority on it?
Right. First of all, in the roundtable discussions, I think one thing that we did, data analytics is kind of the sexy term now. We did data analytics on ethics violations across multiple years all across the world. And we summarized that into types and root causes and presented that in these roundtables. That was tremendously eye-opening. Data is power. They really didn't have the breadth of understanding as the types of things that could occur. And then we personalized it to say, what do we do as leaders that could contribute to that kind of decision making in those cases? And so it was making it a much more internalized introspection after getting the facts. So that was the power of that type of exercise. The way we then try and penetrate the organization is through things like stewardship of ethics, like face-to-face presentations of your results. Anytime there's an ethics violation, operating management meets with senior management and audit on what the disciplinary action should be. So it becomes a very personal thing. And to me, that's when you impact individual behavior. But every organization is different, both from a structure as well as a footprint and whatever. And you have to, as leaders, find out how do you try and make this part of your mission. So there's no one answer.
And I'm sorry, quick little side note. I haven't done a great job at moderating and giving everyone a chance to raise their hand. So please feel free to raise your hand, and then Millie can pick someone who has a question, and we'll walk down the mic to you. Thank you.
That was a great job, by the way.
Since we're talking about training a lot in data analytics, do you have a process, or are there processes that exist where you can actually determine how effective this training is? In other words, do you know that after you conduct a round of training, does the ethical decision making within the organization actually improve? There's any way to really measure that and assess the effectiveness of the training and the investments that are being made in the training?
Yeah, the tough part is establishing the cause-effect relationship, right? We would do ethics training in the course of our normal business, and then we would track trends in ethics violations and report that back to the board. That was part of our normal operating performance. The dilemma is, and I remember specifically a board meeting when I presented these results, and the audit committee chair said, well, are you sure you know all of the violations that occur? Because the results were so low. And so it's like catch-22. Are low results good performance, or is that you're not finding out about the violations? So it's a tough area to do the cause-effect relationship. I think you have to be committed to the mission and committed that in the long run it is going to work. If people understand the value set, and you do believe that most people want to do a good job, they worry about their job. I had one individual, some of it's just getting into people's brains. He had cheated on an expense statement. And I talk about theft at various levels. It always astounds me how people could jeopardize their career or their retirement by cheating on an expense statement for pretty minimal dollars. But when I had the face-to-face with this individual, he said, well, I just ran into a cash flow problem and I needed to buy my daughter a prom dress. And it's like, okay, but your cash flow problem is going to get a lot more serious when you don't have income. And so it's kind of going through the internal process of, look, think about consequences, but also think about what makes good sense. If there's financial assistance, there are other ways to get that. There are friends who can, anyway. So it's hard to do the cause effect. I think all you can do is kind of track trends. I'm big on root cause and trying to learn from a process, and so we instilled a learning process in the whole ethics training. So we would use the data to then incorporate into the next round of ethics training. Here are the kinds of things we see. Let's have discussions about why they occur and modify behavior as we can go. Yes.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I'm Terry Blum. My question is, on your slide, your Maya Angelou
Yes.
slide, you had servant leadership at the top. Can you tell us a little bit more about what servant leadership is and how prevalent a philosophy of leadership you think it is in corporate America?
Two very different questions. First of all, I would encourage you to do research on it because there's a lot of research available. But basically, it is a concept of leadership that says your job is not to achieve, it is to help other people achieve. That's your job as a leader, regardless of whether you have a supervisory title or not. I did a lot of work early in my career around professional development, and people tend to think of professional development as advancing up the managerial ladder, when in fact so many companies, particularly in the oil and gas space, need technical experts at senior levels. And so you can have the same kind of impact as a technical professional in your sphere of influence as you could if you happen to have a managerial title. But the concept of servant leadership is to say you achieve that by developing other people, by motivating other people, and by laying out how to make them successful. And if you do that, then you're a successful leader. Even things like succession planning, which we were religious about in ExxonMobil, you should always be developing people to take your job, as opposed to trying to hold on to your skill set to achieve success. A true leader is developing people. It's very powerful because, for instance, when you're in a performance appraisal situation, which no supervisor or manager typically enjoys, I actually enjoyed them because if you take the concept of just trying to help someone develop and say, here are the 3 things that you are doing fantastically, and you need to do more of that. And here are the 3 things that you probably want to kind of temper that a little. You can then move into a discussion that is a lot more positive for both parties and feel like you're doing some good. And so it can be a very powerful tool if you kind of have that mindset around you're really trying to help other people rather than if you have to fire someone. Same thing. If you can handle that from the standpoint of how can I serve them in this transition, as opposed to get them out the door as quick as I can and get this over with, it can be a much different kind of dialogue. And so it's something that's worth researching and putting into your journey as to whether or not that would be a good makeup for the kind of leader you want to be. I think it's extremely successful, and like I said, it doesn't mean you can't be a type A who demands results. It's all in how you get them.
So I think we have time for one more question. Anybody have anything burning? Yeah, thanks.
Again, thank you for coming today and for your talk.
You're welcome.
Yes, I have a quick question. With all the recent scandals we've had in the news, what are your feelings on whistleblowers and how they are often retributed against in the companies they work for, and how that should be influenced in terms of ethical leadership?
Yeah, it's absolutely incomprehensible to me how you can fire a whistleblower that's credible. So I will, in the interest of good news, encourage you to always realize you may not know all the facts. And on some of these hotlines, you get a whole gamut of information coming in. And so, as part of your leadership bag of tricks, I would always encourage you to say, well, I may not know all the facts, or maybe I'll go get the facts. So with that caveat, if someone truly does come forward and isn't listened to, and the facts are, in fact, as that whistleblower, there is no excuse as to how there should be retribution against those individuals. And those organizations should pay big time for doing that. How do you prevent that from happening? It gets back to your infrastructure. So in the case of ExxonMobil, we had what's a 4-person triumvirate? It's not a triumvirate, it's 4 people. But it was audit, law, HR, and management. And for any type of violation, we would all sit down and review the facts together and try and reach some coordinated decision. So that was a check and balance that went on in terms of how the facts should be looked at and what was real and not real. But it also protected people who came forward. And so you have to put in some of those checks and balances, because otherwise it's not going to work. People are smart. If they find out that, those kind of things are going on, you won't get any whistleblowing going on. So you either take it seriously or it's not going to work at all.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradley. We so appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you. It's fun.
Your knowledge and wisdom and all that you've told us. We just so appreciate you being here.
Good.
So can we do one last round of applause for
Thank you.
Millie Bradley?